So how do we disrupt this kind of system that we're talking about? It's a really difficult one, because ultimately people aren't very comfortable with giving up power. And this whole, the approach to the festival from Dagan Collective's approach has been, actually a lot more people need to give up power and resources, and we need to, just actually act on that rather than have these conversations which seem to happen all the time in this kind of in this kind of industry. So, the kind of talks, if I take you through, we had a wonderful, we started off with talking about climate, and then we moved on to how people can co-create in moments of crisis. So we had Ihtijat, which is an amazing organization based in Syria, and it was a really fantastic talk, and there's a great toolkit that everyone should go and have a look at, which is all about how you support people who are going through crisis. And it was a really lovely, I think it was really hard to imagine what happens with war and displacement. I mean, I know it because I was a Somali refugee, so I get it in some respects, but to communicate what happens when you are displaced and what happens to your culture and how you maintain culture in a world that's kind of very hostile is a very difficult thing. And I think the work that Ihtijat are doing, Rana, Joya and Chloe, it was a wonderful thing to hear about the way in which art, in those moments of crisis, it's essential. It's absolutely essential to have that, the moments of joy that keep your humanity, despite the fact that the world tells you you're valueless. The moments of joy that remind you that you can make theatre, that you can make beautiful music, that all of these things, despite not knowing where you might live or where you're going to be next, that these moments for people who are in refugee camps, who live in this kind of in between the sort of nomadic existence, it's really important, and I think that was wonderful to hear about that. But one of the questions that came up from their session was about how you do this work with highly stressed communities, and what ethics do we need to be aware of when going to communities to do these artistic interventions. So this is really, really difficult. These are really hard questions that we all need to think about in a really deep way. And then we heard from Zana. We went to South Africa. That was amazing. Zana and Joy Gregory, there was this conversation between two amazingly talented black women artists who, Joy Gregory is one of the foremost black British artists. I can't believe I convinced her to come and do this. Go look her up. She's still not, massively well known sometimes, I think, but she's an absolute inspiration and a key part of the black British movement, and she did a lot of work on in South Africa with endangered languages and the conversation, but they both engage in a really bodily kind of relationship to land and nature. And Zana is the most beautiful 24-year-old, stunning. Go and watch her talks. It made everyone really realize what we're fighting for, really realize that this is really about some very basic things here, about care, about coexisting with the natural environment. She comes from a rural part of South Africa, the Ndebele tribe, and she talked about and described how actually if you are always in coexistence, and you're always living. Art is not separated from the way you live your life there. And it's very similar to the way nomadic women, I would say it's very similar to the way Somali women back home. My mum is a nomad, she knows how to weave, the crafting, and if you look at the old word for art, it comes from the word to craft something, and the way in which the art and creativity is not separated from ordinary life was something really powerful that I got from Zana's talk, as well as that already co-creating with nature and really being in communion with this environment. And it was a really powerful moment, I think it made everyone think, let's go out, let's actually have a moment of stillness as well, because everything that we're talking about is about action and dynamic change, which needs to happen quite quickly to avert climate and to avert all sorts of awful things. But there was something beautiful in the way she said, it's really important to have moments of stillness, actually, to give ourselves time to be still in nature, and really, and that makes space and gives space to make yourself, to make your way through this as well. And I think that's one of the things I took away from that talk. And we ended with Enis and Romina talking about their experiences of co-creating dance in, the projects across Argentina and South America, using dance as a medium for helping marginalized communities deal with some pretty awful, not just living conditions, but for women, sexual violence. So there was a whole project around My Body, My House, and how Romina said something beautiful about, silence not being an option. So, I come today really with those words in mind. Silence is not an option. And I think for me, one of the key things is, how do we do this work and really honour all the people who came before us? And there was a lot of talk about ancestral relationships. And I want to quote about Somali Dagan philosophies. So Somali Dagan philosophies are cultural philosophies that are indigenous African philosophies that encapsulate multiple bodies of living comprehensive knowledge. These philosophies are the founding pillars of Somali societies, in as much as they are overarching principles governing Somali people. In their cosmological sense, Dagan philosophies are the common threads that connect Somali peoples to their ancestral homelands in Somalia and to a communal way of life. Somali Dagan philosophies are used as a liberating tool from oppression, grounded in the teachings of our ancestors. And that's from Dr. Ahmed Ilmi. And I think that's how Dagan Collective approach all of our work with the way we work with our communities. It is from that way of communal work. And it's something that I wanted, I was asked to ask a question, or, leave the audience with a question. And I have to ask, is the language, is the terminology of co-creation a tool that's useful for people in power? And who does it serve? I mean, in what ways does it serve the oppressed? I'm talking about from my own perspective of looking at how we liberate ourselves from things, and the marketization of what is, I feel like, a normal way to live for a lot of African or indigenous communities, which live in mutual aid because we're forced to, because we are oppressed, because we are marginalized. We've had to always exist outside capitalism to survive. And so I want to end with a quote from Audre Lorde, because she is amazing. For within living structures defined by profit, by linear power, by institutional dehumanization, our feelings were not meant to survive. And that's all I want to do. I want to enable a space where our feelings are truly free and are able to survive. So my provocation, I guess, is, what does the term co-creation, who does it serve when we're doing this work? Are we doing it truly with that goal of liberation for ourselves and others in mind? Thank you.
Thanks, Foz. That was great. I'm going to hand over to David Price in a moment, and I'm going to obsess about the cushions, but I'm definitely going to come and sit down and look from another angle. If anyone wants to just have a quick stand up or move around, please feel free. But I'm delighted to invite David Price, who's helped me think about shaping these 2 live days. And David, thanks a lot. You've been very helpful.
Well, I want to start by, thanking Sarah, for really giving me an opportunity to get out of the house. Because for the last 2 years, I've been talking to myself. They're called webinars, but you just feel like you're talking to yourself. You know, you speak into the void, and the void never answers back. But also, I wanted to thank her because when I look at this room, it's like looking at a mirror of myself about 30 odd years ago. I'm by a comfortable distance the oldest person in the room today. But in my head, I'm like your age. You know, I'm early 30s, changing the world. I'll talk a little bit about my background. But in reality, you know, I look in the mirror and I'm this old guy. I just look like my dad. And I live a fairly comfortable existence. You know, in my head, I'm down on the cushions with you lot. In reality, if I went down on the cushions, I'd probably never get back up again. You know, because I'm that age. But it's been... When did I stop doing this kind of work? I guess mid-90s. Before that, I was a community musician at Cheetham Hill in North Manchester. And looking back, they were the glory days. Because we had our own theatre, we had a director in residence, we had a youth theatre in residence. There was about 12 of us in the team, and we used to put on these massive big shows, community theatre, co-created shows. But because we're funded by the City Council, you're all too young to remember, but there was a period when Manchester used to bid for the Olympics on almost an annual basis. They never got it, but it didn't stop them from bidding. And so this year, 1989, they said, we're bidding for the Olympics. Could you do a big community show about the nobility of sport? You know, we kind of went, well, it's like 200 people we were working with trying to devise a show. And about 6 weeks into the process, we got word that because of Thatcher and the poll tax cuts, we got word that the centre was going to be closed down and all the programmes that were with it were going to be closed down. So, as you can imagine, the kind of devising sessions that we were having then got pretty despondent. And there was one where, because we had people like 8-year-old and 85-year-old, all different ethnic backgrounds. It was a fabulous group of people to work with. But at one point, I just exploded and he said, what the hell are we doing trying to make a show about sport when it's going to probably be the last show that we're allowed to put on? And I thought, fair point. So we did this handbrake turn, and instead of doing a show about sport, we did a kind of modern day take on Dickens' Hard Times and all about why communities needed to get access to arts and culture. And in one of the sessions that we're having, one of the group said, you know, we are like the weeds. The Arts Council funded organisations, they're like the flowers, but we're the weeds. But the thing about weeds is they're really difficult to kill. And I thought, wow. So together we kind of wrote this song around it, and even though it was 30 odd years ago, I still remember, and I've written the lyrics down of one of the verses. Weeds can be beautiful, what does it matter? For we all know when we're allowed to grow, nothing can hold them back, even concrete on top of them, put a stop to them, finding their way through the cracks. Now, I wanted to start with that story for two reasons. The first is to say, well, how times have changed. Because we put that show on, The Guardian came up and reviewed it and said it was agitprop theatre at its best. It drew the attention of the Arts Council. At one point, one of the Arts Council officers sidled up to me in the interval and said, can you just tell me what a community musician actually does? There was that kind of level of knowledge about what we were doing. And look at them now. This is, you won't be able to read it all, but you're probably familiar with it. It's an extract from the 3-year plan called Let's Create. This just stopped short of saying let's co-create. But when I look at the things that are being said in this, you know, it talks about the innate creativity of people. It talks about how communities are being held together by culture. And I'll leave it to you to decide if, you know, the words are going to be met by actions. But they've come a long way, at least in understanding what the point of this work is to be about. But the second reason I wanted to start with that story is to say that it's not just the arts and culture where co-creation's blossoming. And that's really why I wrote this book. It's actually the second book. First one was called Open, How We'll Work, Live and Learn in the Future. But this one was called The Power of Us. And I started writing it about 4 years ago. And I finished it in February in 2020. Sent it off to the publishers, and then, as Sarah was describing, you know, the world turned upside down, and I thought, I have to write about COVID, I have to include it. So I rewrote the whole book in about 3 weeks. But the point of the book is that I believe there is this explosion of what I call user innovation taking place. And it's not really that well understood. Most people wouldn't be aware, for example, that 53% of all new products and services are created not by the producers, productions. Most of us probably would have to put ourselves in that category as producers now. But instead, they're created by the user innovators. And what I was trying to say in the book is, it's vital that we understand these two groups and we understand their mindset for reasons that I'll come on to in a minute. But if you wanted the most graphic example of the user innovator mindset and the producer mindset, you wouldn't have to look any further than the Homebrew Computing Club, which was a group of people who used to meet on a weekly basis in what has now become known as Silicon Valley, and they were sharing plans essentially that would lead to the creation of the personal computer. So the personal computer is another example of something that was created by users, except that two of the group were the two Steves, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. And this quote from Steve Wozniak kind of gets to the heart, I think, of that. This was an open source group. Everybody agreed that they would share all the designs, all the hacks that they'd been doing. But he said that night the full image of the one popped into my head, and I knew that I'd have my own useful computer for basically no money. Yeah, well, what happened then, of course, as we all know, is that Apple got founded and they adopted the producer mindset, which actually in their case meant closing everything down and essentially shutting themselves off from the users in the belief that they would create brilliant products. So I'm not saying that the user innovator mindset is necessarily any better than the producer mindset. I think we need both. But what I do see is that bad things happen when the producer mindset squeezes out the user mindset, or if you like, the co-creator mindset. And I wrote the book really to highlight what I'd call the inevitability of what I call people-powered innovation. So if you think about it in kind of chronological sequence, there was first sharing what we know, the knowledge economy, and then that kind of happened around about the same time as sharing what we own. You know, so our houses, our cars. We've now got a Romanian rescue dog, and before she did that, my wife borrowed a dog. I didn't believe you could actually share dogs, but there's a website called Borrow My Doggy. Pretty much everything that we've got can be shared. Now, some people have exploited that, whereas other websites like couchsurfing.com have stayed true to that user innovator mindset. But what we're at now, I think, is the point that all people, Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, described as the artisanal economy, which is sharing what we create. And most of you have probably already used websites like Etsy or Patreon. There's a whole bundle of them. You've probably been to makerspaces and Fab Labs, so you know what I'm talking about here. What I speculated in the book was, will we actually go to a fourth stage, which is cooperative production? Can we take peer production to scale? And it was just a speculation, really. COVID showed, I think, that we absolutely can, and I believe we should. And I just want to share with you 3 points, I guess, around peer production, and particularly around the lessons that it's got in terms of the arts and cultural sector. First is, if COVID taught us anything, it's taught us that communities are outperforming bureaucracies. So Sarah talked about those early days of the pandemic. What we also saw was this outpouring of self-help which was going on. 1,000 Facebook groups set up to make sure that people in your village were being fed and that they were being looked after. Scrub Hubs, national network of people who were creating gowns and face shields and PPE at a time when hospitals and surgeries were desperately in need of them. Meanwhile, bloody Peppa Pig was, buying in 10 years out of date PPE from Turkey. And that's not an isolated incident. You'll also remember, I hope, although he tries to forget that he said it, but Peppa Pig also said we would have a world-beating COVID tracking app. Don't know if you remember that. Only the people in the Isle of Wight ever got to use it because it wouldn't work on bloody iPhones or Android phones. Meanwhile, two 17-year-olds that I interviewed for the book, Ryan Jun-So Hong in Korea and Avi Schiffman in America, both of them, 17-year-old, both of them created COVID tracking websites over the course of about 3 days. And they're still being used. They're still kind of authoritative sources of information. So I think we are seeing that communities are outperforming bureaucracies. The second thing, though, is that participation's not the same as co-creation. We've had about 30 plus years of outreach from arts organisations. And I think we're at the point now where simply taking part is no longer enough. And my initial approach to community-based music work was kind of to write songs on behalf of people. I thought I was doing the right thing, but actually putting words into people's mouths is no longer enough. And I think the difference between participation and co-creation lies in who has the power and what's the purpose behind the making. And that takes us to the third kind of lesson from all this, which is, forgive me, it's a bit kind of convoluted, but we have seen, not just within COVID, but within the growth of social movements, we've seen this shift in the power dynamic. And I know it probably doesn't feel like it for a lot of people, but we have seen Black Lives Matter have a huge impact. We've seen the Me Too movement. We've actually had more successful social movements in the past 10 years than in the previous century before it. Some of them have been organised by young people. The two largest protests the world has ever seen were both organised by school kids. The largest one was Greta Thunberg and her colleagues in the climate strike. Second largest was the young people who organised the March for Our Lives, those students who were involved in that horrific mass shooting in Parklands, Florida. But we're also seeing now, because of what's happened as a result of the pandemic, that the workplace is never going to be the same again. We are never going to go back to having everybody in the office 9 to 5. The hybrid working is a reality and it's a permanent shift. The labour shortage is going to be really interesting because this so-called resignation wave, I don't believe is going to stop anytime soon. So that's kind of suggested that there is this shift which is taking place. Some friends of mine run a culture company called Sparks and Honey. They produced a report recently. It's free to download. I would strongly recommend it. And it's called The Equity Effect. And the phrase they used was, "You're not the leader anymore, your people are." And I think when you look at Greta Thunberg's comment about blah, 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 and that she'd rather be out on the streets than in the hall at Glasgow, and then you see what happened on that farcical last day, you can see that her words kind of cut through. So I think this upheaval and this shift presents a number of challenges for us when we're working with co-creators. Because, frankly, some of us are doing that work with the tacit support, or in some cases financial support, of people who represent that system, which a lot of those co-creators, especially young co-creators, have actually rejected. And I think you know that the world's really turned weird when you see things like this. We are now seeing a phenomenon where Some of our corporations are thinking more like social movements, but some of our social movements are adopting the kind of marketing tactics of our corporations. Now, you could take a cynical view about organizations like Nike. You know, they've used Colin Kaepernick in their advertising campaign, but Black Lives Matter have benefited and have worked closely with Nike. So, you know, I'll leave it up to you as to whether they're doing it for the right kind of reasons. But the other two that are in this slide, Yvonne Chouinard and Melinda, they have kept that user innovator mindset, even though they are producers. They founded Patagonia, and you all know about Patagonia probably, and you know that it's hard to tell when Patagonia stops being a social movement and becomes a corporation, and that's intentional. They always set it up as something that would do both. So I think we're at a really, really interesting juncture because of this. We're seeing this great re-evaluation which is taking place. You know, 75% of Brits during the summer contemplated either quitting their job, moving house, or leaving their partner. 75%. 4 million Americans quit their job in April and have been doing so every month ever since. So these things are real. And what it means, I think, that shift in the power dynamic right now is that everything is up for grabs. And I believe the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves will define our future. So I want to finish by just going back to that I worked with 30-odd years ago. Because those people who were facing the kind of temporary, and it was just a temporary loss of their artistic voice, they defiantly sang words that we all wrote together, which turned out to be strangely prophetic, I think. The show was called Stars Below, and the last song had this verse in it. There is a new day coming when the way that the world will be known is not what you do for a living that matters, but what can you make that's your own? Now, it seemed kind of ridiculous at that point, but I think 30-odd years on, we are finally at that point where we're not defining ourselves by our job titles. Because for many people, they don't have a job or they have 6 or 7 different jobs. And I'm not being naive. I know the future is highly contested. Set aside the climate catastrophe or the daily erosion of democratic norms that is taking place, you know, by stealth most of the time, on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's obscured under a barrage of distractions and shiny things. But if taking part is not enough, we've got to ask ourselves, what are we co-creating for? And in researching the book, I looked at a wide range of social movements and how they managed to succeed in spite of the opposition to change. And I think there's a lot we can learn from some of these social movements. First thing is, tell a really clear story. But it's their story. They're not putting words into people's mouths. They're highly inclusive and they're creative. And in some cases, yeah, they didn't maybe get the story right. You know, if you think about Occupy, had a fantastic slogan, we're the 99%. But they didn't really know what the outcome was going to be. And I think this business about putting words into people's mouths, you know, I've been guilty of it myself. I don't think it's the worst thing that you can do in the world, particularly if it comes from a place where your motivation is coming from a place of humility or, dare I say it, love. But the real question I've got, I guess, for you, and Sarah asked us to leave you with questions, which is, what is your motivation for co-creation? You know, what would you put, if you were a social movement, and I believe that it is, what do you put on your professional placard? Mine is too big to fit on the placard, but I'll leave you with it. And it's simply this. If we allow our stories to be told by those who want to keep us sedated and compliant, we'll have nobody left to blame but ourselves. So, if not now, when? And if not us, who? Thank you very much for listening.
Oh, David, thanks so much. I've been reminded, hearing Fozia and David speak, that one of the things that we wanted to create today was to hopefully give people opportunity to bask in some lovely words and not think about what we do each day, and just to think about quite big things and and not think about the emails that we haven't sent or what we're doing in the office. And I sort of totally sunk into both of the things that you spoke about, and it made me think about big picture, which I think is always a great thing to think about. We're going to end this session with David and Benji from Arts and Homelessness. And then I think I always get obsessed because I don't like sitting down for long. We should have a little stretch if people want to. And then there's an opportunity to ask some questions to all the speakers. And then I have asked each of the speakers to set some questions to you. And I might encourage you to find some people to have a discussion about those questions with. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to David and Benji. Thank you.
Just going to take my sticker off, it keeps peeling off and annoying me. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's David Tovey. I'm an artist, I'm an activist, I'm a campaigner, educator. I'm also one of the senior producers at Arts In Homelessness International. And I'll...
Hello. Hiya. I'm Benji Lane. I am a creative associate at Arts In Homelessness International, and I work freelance across arts and housing spaces.
I'm going to test this now. By the way, I haven't been to Peppa Pig World, so I will try not to lose my space as we go through these notes. Arts and Homelessness International works to bring positive change to people, projects and places. In homelessness through arts and creativity, engagement with creativity can increase people's well-being, agency, resilience, knowledge and skills, enabling people not just to survive, but to actually thrive. Our vision is a world in which creativity is an integral part of homelessness, and people who are or have been homeless are an intrinsic part of the arts. We focus on connecting and strengthening projects and advocating for arts to be part of homeless support and policy. We do this in several ways, through exchanges, events, research and training, and everything we do throughout our entire charity is co-produced, with 50% of our staff and board people with lived experience of homelessness. And I'm one of those people with lived experience of homelessness, and I'm one of the senior producers. So that's really important for us. Today, I've been asked to talk about, or we've been asked to talk about co-creation in a crisis and what our homeless arts sector provided during COVID. This was a really difficult subject to work around for us because we found COVID trebled our work overnight, instantly overnight. And where half of our staff were then suddenly shut, me being one of them, our workload just went astronomical. So we had to sort of like put a lot of well-being and thought into our work. So as soon as the world shut down, we suddenly had to shift our focus. And we were due to open our cultural spaces responses to homelessness training the week we went into lockdown. Obviously, that probably wasn't the best time to be launching a cultural spaces training program with the cultural sector being decimated overnight. So within 48 hours, we had to change our event to an online event. We still introduced our training, don't get me wrong, we still introduced it to the cultural sector, but we also looked at what cultural venues and staff could do with COVID-19 pandemic on top of us. We launched what can cultural, I'm going to, sorry, glasses for this bit. What can cultural spaces do to respond to COVID-19 for their homeless communities? We co-produce this with the Museum of Homelessness, the Union Chapel, and those with lived experience of homelessness. And I want to run through, or we're going to run through, a list of the 11 points that we came up as a group. Number 1, reach out to your local homelessness partners and ask what they need. Make contact with smaller grassroots groups rather than big charities, many of whom are providing a lot of extra support as formal services close down.
Number 2, become a hub for storage and food drops, which was a really popular take, that one.
It was actually very popular, and we'll get onto that in a bit. Number 3, donate dry and tin food from cafe suppliers in cultural spaces.
Offer use of kitchen and space for local organisations.
Number 5, offer other products, e.g. latex gloves, masks, and artistic materials.
A hub for clothes drops.
Key campaign messages to government, local authorities and any corporate partners, and we will get on to that point further on.
Cultural spaces with vans or lorries can be used for distribution of food and clothes.
Raise money for local homeless centres or food banks, e.g. by putting artistic content online and asking for donations.
Number 10, artistic content. People who are or have been homeless will become even more isolated. Lots of cultural organisations are putting content online and running some of their creative workshops as webinars, which is good for people who have a computer and internet access. For those who don't, you can post or deliver creative projects, including community writing projects, materials, art packs, send out disposable cameras for a photography project, artistic content projected onto walls of buildings.
And finally, please don't open up as communal spaces as a night shelter. However well-intentioned that may be, it will increase the spread of COVID-19. People sleeping rough need a single room with a bathroom. Hotel rooms or college halls or residence are ideal. That was the list that we all co-produced and we're currently.
So this set of suggestions ushered in a really powerful response from the sector. Although cultural spaces were closed, with devastating financial consequences for most of us and our staff, many of us still wanted to respond and share support within our local communities, and particularly our local homeless communities and those facing food poverty. The Union Chapel, which is based in Islington, became a hub for grassroots organisations, organising local community food banks, etc. The old Arts Centre, which is in Camden, became a food bank up until a couple of months ago. The Museum of Homelessness packed away our current show and repurposed the exhibition shelving and turned it into a food shelf storage situation. So the whole exhibition and our archive became a literal infrastructure for our task force hub. Museum of Homelessness again spearheaded a proposal alongside other grassroots organisations for a public booking for hotels for a, how do we phrase it, to house people who were left outside who perhaps wanted to go inside, and that ended up catalysing the government's response to everybody in. This alone housed 37,000 people who were living on the streets. Following from that, the museum set up a task force which ran for 5 months from March until July, which was in a disused council pop-up space, which ended up becoming a bit of our community centre for 5 months. Many people from the arts sector volunteered 7 days a week, joined in and supported, sharing food, essentials, art supplies, and other necessary essentials with people who were living in the emergency accommodation or still living outside. The winter afterwards was spent operating on the streets, where we were sharing solidarity with our friends who were still living outside, and this response was co-created through lots of conversations within our communities and listening to what people actually needed and perhaps wanted to see, and then finding ways to make it happen.
So suddenly, because everyone was bought in, not everyone, but the majority, 37,000 people, and placed into hotels, which, to be honest, became a little bit like prison cells for the people living there. This left us with a problem. we suddenly had the pressures of isolation due to the hotel residents not being able to leave their rooms. They weren't even allowed to go and get their meals from a central location. Their meals were delivered to their rooms. It was, like I said, it was like being in a prison cell. A lot of these hotels didn't have facilities. They didn't have cooking facilities. They didn't have TVs, radios, anything like this. So a group of the homeless art groups came together and co-created some, I guess, sort of like ways of being able to provide provision and work with the people within these hotels. So collaboration was developed between Kabul Citizens, the Reader and St Mungo's in the UK, and they piloted a way of being able to bring creative activities into hotel-housed people who were sleeping rough in London. A simple idea came about, a little mobile library. And I know it sounds quite simple. It's a library. It's just a few free books, right? But if that's the first piece of interaction that you're having with somebody outside of that room, it helps to build relationships and to break down those barriers. So a group of volunteers came together and started to go around the hotel emergency accommodations with little mobile libraries offering books to anybody who wanted to read these. And it became this initial step to work and inspire people to engage a little bit more. This was a great way for people to experience literature, first of all. It was also a tool to survive and to live well. Having the opportunity of a mobile library in the hotels helped us create a connection with those residents. It was a way to create a conversation, like I said, and help us start building those relationships. You've got to remember, when working with people who are entrenched rough sleepers, there's this fear of trust, and to try and build those relationships takes time, and it's small chicken steps at a time. Within those books, we sent out postcards asking the residents what arts and culture they were interested in. You know, were they interested in drawing, creative writing, etc. From those postcards, we were then able to connect services and art groups, accumulate a London-based creative project, which I'm a massive fan of, to be honest with. This group is life-changing, right? They started to create art packs for the hotels from the information that we were receiving. The Reader, they started phoning the hotel rooms and doing one-on-one book reading and poetry reading over the phone to help take away that boredom and that isolation. Kabul Citizens, they started creating these weekly creative challenges for people in the hotels, you know, whether it was writing a verse, whether it was writing part of a paragraph, a book. You'll be surprised how many books were written by homeless people throughout the COVID situation. And some films were made as well. I recently just received a film from one of those COVID hotels, which is an hour-long documentary film, and it's fantastic. It is absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit. And like for a lot of people, it was a big change of lifestyle. Like we've all had like a massive change over 18 months. But if you've been living outside for 30 years perhaps, or since you were a teenager and you're now in your 50s or 60s, being asked or sometimes forced to move inside is a very traumatic experience. So a lot of folks were finding ways to soothe themselves or each other, and these techniques of calling up and keeping in touch was a part of that. It was a softening of the blow of a sort. Yeah. Following on from this, Haringey Council asked us to help create some art workshops. We sent out postcards to residents who were staying in some of the hotels. Accumulate then provided photography, creative writing and graffiti workshops, which resulted in a beautiful, huge garden mural. You see, COVID suddenly showed the whole country the value of the arts, especially as we were all struggling with our mental health. COVID resulted in further isolation for a lot of people who had been experiencing that for a long time before COVID ever hit, particularly people who were facing homelessness. So creative projects were used to mitigate boredom, loneliness, and to build well-being as well.
Then followed Coventry. And for us, when we noticed the Everyone In campaign, which was, obviously everyone went into lockdown, 37,000 people were left out on the streets homeless. We managed to then, through campaigning, bring these people in and get them into accommodation. In Coventry, they had 3 small hotels, and it was very disjointed, and it was extremely hard to try and provide enough support mechanisms within those places, especially when some of us were in lockdown ourselves, and trying to get the art groups to be able to volunteer and stuff like that. And the council saw this, so they brought us all together as a city council, their homeless team, Jim Crawshaw, and spoke with us and said, right, we want to try and provide a wraparound of services within a new hotel. So they commandeered one of the central hotels in Coventry and closed down the 3 smaller hotels and brought everyone into one hotel. And on the very first day of everyone being there, we had arts activities embedded into everything that they were doing there. These were partnerships with the City Council, Crisis, Coventry City of Culture 21. And we produced one of the largest arts programs in any of the COVID response hotels, with activities running every single day, from mosaic making, music lessons, embroidery, card making, Xmas decoration making, film and pizza nights, creative writing, dance, theatre, the list goes on. It was mind-blowing, which was what was put into the hotel there. It was such a success that out of all the residents housed at the day's hotel, only 1 resident went back out onto the streets, thus proving that if you invest in people by giving them what they need instead of what you believe, have amazing results all round, which are life-changing. And I know I'm saying life-changing as in it's just a word, I'm throwing it out there, but it truly was life-saving. By bringing these people in off the streets and giving them investment and valuing them as human beings, we saved 37,000 people's lives. And that's phenomenal. As well as this, our international partners were also providing cultural access. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Path of Art in Seattle, Washington. They listened to the concerns of their homeless students, and I think they've got around about 800 students that use their art school on a daily basis. And listening to them and knowing that a lot of these people were going to be put into isolation, affecting their well-being, a lot of them living with PTSD and trauma, that they decided to move their entire art school online. But obviously, that was going to cause accessibility problems. So what they did as an organisation, they invested in iPads and tablets for every single student that wanted to still engage with the project. They paid for internet access. They paid for one-on-one tutoring. I was lucky enough that they even asked me, based in the UK, to teach. And this was last May, I believe it was, and I'm still teaching there now, because they've decided that it was such a success that they decided to keep their art school as a hybrid model, so they could have people who didn't want to come in and share a space yet because of the fear of COVID. So yeah.
We knew the importance of bringing people together ourselves. It's the way that we usually work, and we knew that this is the only way to function at the time as well. So we set up our monthly international Zoom conversations at 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. every last Wednesday. This space will create more opportunities for our community to come together and share and support during COVID. The space helped us build connections and deepen our relationships. The Central Public Library in Dallas organised the community around on their doorstep People didn't have anywhere to go in the first few months of COVID, and around this Dallas library there were a lot of people sleeping outside. And this is a recent letter from them with an update.
And before I go on to the letter, and if anyone is interested in our international conversations, you're more than welcome. Anyone interested in arts and homelessness, they're free. They're every last Wednesday of the month, 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. Great little plug, sorry. And it's tomorrow, by the way, if you'll know. But you can find it on our website, or just go on to Arts and Homelessness International Eventbrite. I want to share a letter, and I want to give you a little bit more detail of the library and Central Library in Dallas. On a daily basis, they have around about 280 homeless people coming and using their venue. This is the importance of public buildings and cultural spaces, right? You know, not only is it a place to come and enjoy art, be part of art, but it's about providing a space to just be yourself. It's like you were talking about space, and it was making me smile, because spaces like this are so fundamentally important for my community. Because yes, they give you a dry, warm space. You have facilities to use, bathrooms, toilets. There are certain venues around the UK and abroad where you can come in and get free food, free tea and coffee. And having accessibility so people can feel that they are part of a community and a part of a space is so important, right? We all deserve that. You know, these are public buildings, they're here for everyone. And I was talking at an event last Wednesday and at a Barbican, and I turned around and said, for my community, it's so difficult to get our stories heard and have that space, because we're always shut away at the front door. We're turned away because of the way we look, the way we smell, the way we behave. And that's really, really difficult. So for somebody like me who had that lived experience, to then suddenly be standing on a stage talking to people who have the opportunities to help my community is massive for me. And that's what co-production does, right? It gives us that ability to my voice is important and my space is important. So just remember that. I want to share a letter. So the public library, they provide space for the homeless community, and have been for many years, because they saw the importance of these people coming and using their spaces. Over the years, they've provided free education courses, they've provided free music lessons, and took down all the rules. Like, there was rules around saying you can't eat in the building, blah, 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 and all this. They were like, actually, they're still going to eat in the building. They're just, by taking down the rules and allowing them to eat, they're not going to put all the chicken bones in the books anymore, and hide it everywhere, right? So Joe Guidis, who is the chief exec there, who's a very good friend of mine. I've known her for very many years now, and I have so much respect for this woman, because when COVID happened and everything shut down and all the shelters in Dallas shut, she suddenly had 300 people camped outside her building and was like, who's helping them? Who's giving them access to food, water, etc., etc. So I'm going to read the letter that we received. It's about a year ago now. It was about November last year, so way after the first lockdown. And this is what she says. I'm just going to... Sorry, I got attacked by my cat last night at 2 o'clock this morning, and he split all the inside of my lips, hence why I'm having to keep drinking. I've got slash marks on my face, so... I'm telling you, like, it was a wreck this morning. So anyway, here we go. We are still involved while our buildings are closed. Back when we first shut down in March 2020, and before the city responded to help, I had a small village living on the library's front lawn. On any given day, we had between 80 to 120 people camping with us. I quickly provided porta potties, Portaloos for us in the UK, and partnered with the First Presbyterian Church a block away to provide a daily sack lunch. It took me a while to get another church to provide breakfast, and we had lots of drive-by food donations in the evenings. 2 library staff, my security team, and I were the only ones in our 10-storey library. And we spent most of our time engaging these wonderful folks. Getting to know their stories. And trying to connect them with family when possible. I even bought a few bus tickets. We also devised a system to bring in their devices, to charge them and give them back after a couple of hours. With not any real trouble, each morning I went out and handed out gloves and trash bags, and we all picked up together before the power washing crew arrived to do a proper cleaning. We had a nice routine, but it was not meant to last. It took the city almost 6 weeks of seeing this to decide to open an emergency shelter in our convention centre. I cried. The day I helped most of them move over there, less than a block from us. Many didn't want to go, but they closed my plaza, so many just had to move camp elsewhere. After that, we provided the daytime enrichment in the shelter. I had 8 library staff there daily with computers, games, cards, books, etc. Anything to help pass the time and hopefully find a way home or get them into a proper shelter. That lasted from April 25th through to the August. Since that large shelter closed, the city purchased a few hotels and have gotten into transitional housing. We're working with our partners to go in and apply for federal stimulus checks for the government is providing those who are unemployed, and that's where we are today. The best news is my libraries will reopen for in-person use on May 4th, and we have a plan to place for our friends experiencing homelessness to have a spot to sit, their devices, read, get on a computer. They will have to wear a mask and only be in groups of 2, so it will be an adjustment. I think it will work for now until we move into a less restrictive phase of being open. Cheers to you and all you're doing. I'm hopeful we can gather in person again soon. Sending much love, Joe. And I'm really sorry, it's really difficult for me to talk about because I know how difficult it must be for those residents camped outside and knowing how brilliant the staff are of a cultural space to go way beyond what is asked of them, right? Way beyond. It's not even a job to food, shelter, lose. That's the government and the local council. So for cultural spaces to step up like this is really enriching for me. And I think that's why I struggle, because I never had that when I was on the streets. And I think that's where, you know, having voices like ours in the room is so important. But yeah. Sorry.
You don't have to be sorry. It makes me think a lot around like you were saying, David, around your placard and your professional plan, and what does it say on there, and what does it mean? What do our day jobs mean? What do they mean for us personally? And whose spaces are these in reality? And who do they serve? I think the space of co-creation for me is a space for people to be together, but also to fall apart. Like, things aren't always okay, and people fall apart and things fall apart. And co-creation for me needs to encompass that as well. For things to fall apart and we can build anew and collage it out. And it's also a space to create and explore and question on an unhomogenized level. Like, quite often if we are brought in, we do reach out, quite often there's an ask for people to be of the same nature in some way, or to create in the same way, but we're also different, so how can we ask each other? There is a way to be unhomogenized and be together at the same time, and honour the true nature of community and the substances of our relationships with ourselves and each other. Yeah, our provocation pretty much echoes Fozia's brilliant provocation all around. makes sense that we're on the same discussion. Yeah, we were wondering around, specifically around like funding applications. That's like a big pet peeve of mine. Like we have all these tick boxes and we're asked, you must work with the community, or we're encouraged to, or told to, essentially. And how does that affect the way that we work and the setting up of initiatives, or what does serving and engaging with the community actually mean? And where is sincere co-creation in all of that? Where does it lie for us?
Yeah,